Our lecture today is on the biology of schizophrenia, certainly the most baffling of all the various behavior disorders. And we'll be exploring this from a number of different perspectives. And my goal is to give you a broad-based background in this particular behavior disorder, in which there's been a very significant amount of research that has been done, but still, I would say, no real solutions in terms of treatment for this total shattering, really, of individual's personality. One of the things that I like to do in this area is to show students this very famous painting. And the painting was done by a European artist by the name of Edvard Munch, and it's called The Scream, and it recently sold for $120 million, and it's many refer to it as the face that launched 1,000 therapists. And though Munch never let on as to what the painting was thought to portray, it really has been adopted by the clinical psychology community as representing an individual suffering from a psychotic-based disorder and the inner turmoil that such individuals experience. So you will see this painting in many books, many certainly presentations about schizophrenia, because it is thought to represent an individual who is suffering a great deal and an individual that is psychotic. So with that being said, let's take a look at the major questions in the area of schizophrenia research. And first and foremost is, this is considered to be complete personality disintegration, and it is the most baffling of all behavior disorders. And I think that we need to understand that this has been a disorder that we have tried to come to grips with in terms of diagnosis and in terms of treatment, but I think that it still continues to elude us. I want to take a look at the recent evidence that is suggesting more and more that genes are playing a role in this, that they are impacting major neurotransmitter systems in the brain, namely and principally in terms of dopamine. And then I want to take a look at some new treatments that have emerged from some cutting-edge research that now give us, a little bit more hope in terms of helping those individuals suffering from this disorder and helping their families. There's, I believe, some videos that I've made available to you that you should watch. Namely about this young woman by the name of Anik, who suffered from psychotic-based disorder, from schizophrenia. And I think that by looking at that, that'll give you an even better understanding of what this disorder is all about and how it impacts families and how it impacts society. So again, if you have not already watched that, you should watch it soon. So here's what the DSM has to say about schizophrenia. It's defined as principally characterized by deteriorating judgment, deteriorating ability to function in everyday life. And there's a number of different symptoms, debilitating symptoms, that we'll be talking about as we go along. If you take a look, I try to help students to understand this by putting a face on schizophrenia. This is just a short list, really, of some individuals that have suffered from schizophrenia. The famous comedian Darrell Hammond ended up taking as a very severe schizophrenic individual. John Hinckley, who of course assassinated John Lennon. Jack Kerouac, the famous novelist. John Nash, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and Vincent van Gogh, again, this very famous self-portrait of Vincent van Gogh. So again, this is a disorder that can really strike anyone, and I think more and more, as we try to understand this disorder, we appreciate the fact that these are individuals who really are tormented in their life from this particular disorder. Symptoms of schizophrenia, again, the primary ones: delusional thinking. Delusions of grandeur, for example, not uncommon. Inappropriate affect. Situations where you would expect them to be very happy, instead they're just the opposite. There's other situations where you would expect them to be very sad, they are just the opposite. So it's totally inappropriate affect given the kind of situation that they're in. Certainly hallucinations. It is not uncommon for schizophrenics to hear imaginary voices and to, telling the person what to do, telling them what to do, or commenting negatively on their particular behavior. So again, they hear these imaginary voices and they're controlled by those voices. Incoherent thought, principally meaning that this is illogical thinking. Belief in supernatural forces, for example. Very odd behaviors, long periods of time in which an individual psychotic doesn't move. Their personal hygiene suffers. They talk in rhymes. They avoid at any cost social interactions. So again, these are the principal symptoms of schizophrenia. When you take a look at the epidemiology of this disorder, and one thing I like to try to do, these are actually paintings that are on a number of these slides that were done by schizophrenic individuals, and again, a number of them are very, very interesting and very good. This is a disorder that affects about 1% of the population, and it can range in severity from being something that is acute to something that is chronic to something in which the symptoms are not as severe. Again, there's a wide range of severity, but again, about 1% of the population. And this is something that is seen throughout the world. It occurs, again, all parts of the world. There's some interesting data here that indicates that it's more common in the United States and Europe than in third world countries, but some of this certainly may be due to differences in terms of diagnosis. Even though the DSM is generally used in many different countries, it may be that it's just a reflection of differences in terms of diagnosis. More common in men than in women by a ratio of about 7 to 5. It seems to be more severe with early onset. That is principally in the case of men, not anywhere near as much in the case of women. So indeed, time of onset seems to be a very important determining factor. Another interesting factor that no one, to my knowledge, has really been able to understand in terms of what it means is the likelihood of schizophrenia increases as the age of the father increases. So older fathers are more likely to have a schizophrenic child than younger fathers. So again, interesting epidemiological data here. The causes of schizophrenia, certainly we suspected for a long period of time that it's something about an individual's biology, and I'll be, taking a look at some of that evidence, but it is by no means definitive. The symptoms can vary greatly. Again, it can be either acute or chronic. In the case of acute schizophrenia, that is sudden onset, typically there is a pretty good chance for recovery. In the case of chronic schizophrenia, the onset is much more gradual, and typically it lasts for a much longer period of time. If you take a look at the major forms of schizophrenia, they all have something in common, and that is there are intellectual problems, emotional problems, and perceptual problems in terms of how they view themselves and how they view other individuals. But let's take a look at a breakdown of the various forms of schizophrenia. One is called simple schizophrenia, and these individuals over a relatively extended period of time show detachment in terms of interpersonal relationships. But they are left typically apathetic and indifferent. That's what we call simple schizophrenia. In hebephrenic schizophrenia, and this is the classic stereotype really of insanity, this is very severe personality disintegration. For those of you who may have seen the film from a number of years ago, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that starred Jack Nicholson, that was really the classic stereotype of a hebephrenic schizophrenic. I encourage you to see that film in order to understand the disorder a little bit more. There's also catatonic schizophrenia. These are individuals who are really preoccupied with the stream of consciousness. They typically are mute. It's difficult, if not impossible, to make any kind of social contact with these individuals at all. And then there's paranoid schizophrenia. These individuals are convinced that other people are after them. Some of you may have seen the movie from a number of years ago, A Beautiful Mind, that starred Russell Crowe. It depicted this individual here, John Nash, who was a Nobel Prize winner, Nobel Prize winning economist at Princeton University. And he had terrible bouts of paranoid schizophrenia, in which he thought that other individuals were plotting against him. Again, another great movie to see to really understand this disorder a little bit better. So schizophrenia has two different clusters of positive symptoms. Psychotic-based symptoms in which individuals are delusional, they have hallucinations, these unfounded beliefs, abnormal kinds of sensory experiences. And then there is disorganized thinking, in which they have inappropriate emotional displays. So again, these are the two clusters of positive symptoms that we see. There are also what we call negative symptoms, and simply put, these are behaviors that are absent that should be present. Like social interaction, for example, that is very weak. Emotional expression, which can be non-existent. Speech patterns, working memory. Again, these are all behaviors that are absent that should be present. Negative symptoms typically are stable, and they are incredibly difficult to treat. Twin studies have been very informative here. Twin studies really do suggest that there is a genetic component. If we take a look at concordance work with monozygotic twins have a much higher concordance rate than do dizygotic twins. So take a look at this chart that you see here. Here, monozygotic twins, it's about 48%. In terms of concordance rates in comparison to dizygotic twins, which is only about 17%. So this really suggests a very strong genetic component, but again, it's not 100%, which suggests that there's certainly some kind of an environmental component as well. Schizophrenia is increased by the presence of the disorder in biological parents. So if you have parents, one of whom is schizophrenic, you have a higher risk of developing schizophrenia yourself. But it's not something that we see in adoptive parents. So again, this is another indication that what we're talking about is an underlying genetic component. The neurodevelopmental hypothesis has really driven a lot of research in this area, a lot of our knowledge in this area. And what this is saying is that there's some kind of damage to the brain early in life, which doesn't show up until later on. There's been some wonderful primate research that has been done, which is summarized in this part of the slide here, where damage is done to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortical area of the brain of primates. And what they do is they follow these primates over a period of time, and they find that there's little effect of the lesion early on, that is at age 1 year, but by 2 years they're seeing some very pronounced effects of the lesion. So again, this leads us to think that maybe there is something happening during early periods of development, and prefrontal cortical damage is something that that many have speculated about for a long period of time. So this is a structure that matures slowly, and again, at an earlier age, you don't see a manifestation of this, but again, the primate work suggests that there is something that may be going on here in the case of, at least in the case of infrahuman primates, and more likely in the case of human beings as well. So this is one of the principal, principal theories that has been explored, this neurodevelopmental hypothesis, and it's one of the, I think, the guiding principles of what this may be related to. So prenatal factors, certainly there are risk factors. Poor nutrition of the mother during pregnancy, premature birth, low birth weight, complications during delivery. These are all things that certainly may predispose an individual to schizophrenia. Head injuries during early childhood are another big risk factor where there's an increased incidence of schizophrenia. Other risk factors, viral infections, something that has also been suspected. Some really interesting data on season of birth, where a tendency for people that are born in the winter to have a slightly greater probability of developing schizophrenia. Latitude also seems to have an impact, and latitudes far from the equator. There's a much higher incidence of schizophrenia. That may be complicated by things like complications during delivery, nutritional factors, viral infections. We don't know, but these are all, important risk factors. Brain abnormalities is an area obviously of intense interest. Schizophrenia is associated with deficits in the left temporal and frontal lobe of the cortex, larger than normal ventricles. That's another classic finding in this area, but again, not for all individuals. Also areas that mature slowly, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortical area. It's not uncommon to see schizophrenic individuals to have problems in terms of working memory, and this is something that's especially common in those individuals with complications during birth. So again, these are all, interesting. This is interesting data, which again argues that we are talking about something that's biologically based. This work by Torrey and Gottesman, some of the most important work in this area, in which they've been looking at identical twins with schizophrenia. And one of the things that we know is that when we take a look at discordant pairs, for example, where one member is schizophrenic and the other one is not, the schizophrenic twin tends to have this loss of brain tissue and larger ventricles. So again, here's this very large ventricles that you see here, which indicates that there's been a cell loss that is occurring, compared now with the normal twin that we see right here. So again, this is another leading area of research that's helped us a great deal to understand this disorder. Schizophrenia, when we take a look at MRIs, which will show cortical loss in early onset schizophrenia, if you take a look at this, take a look at those areas that are pink and red, that's where you're getting the most cell loss. So here's our cell loss that is occurring, again, from these different views. This is an early onset schizophrenia. When we take a look at these individuals 5 years later, same subjects, what you're seeing is even more dramatic loss. So again, this cortical loss is another characteristic of schizophrenia. It is loss of cells, loss of neurons. Some things to consider in terms of therapies for schizophrenia. You have to understand that this is a lifelong disorder for the most part, and it's going to require medication throughout a period, throughout the lifetime of the individual. Typically, psychotherapy is not the first line of treatment. It is certainly always used in combination with medication. It will help the schizophrenic individuals. It will assist them in terms of learning some positive skills in their lives, but it is in and of itself is not the answer. Typically, we're talking about combinations of therapies, whether they be psychotherapy in combination with medication or various family group therapies as well. It's always combined with medication. Drug treatment for schizophrenia. These are what we call the antipsychotic neuroleptic drugs. They tend to relieve schizophrenia, the symptoms of schizophrenia. Certainly the one that has been used for the longest period of time is chlorpromazine. It's one of the first drugs that was developed back in the 1950s, referred to it as that time as Thorazine. And again, it tends to relieve those positive symptoms that we see, the delusions and the hallucinations. The relief usually is experienced not immediately, 2 to 3 weeks after it is administered, and then an individual has to be on this for an extended period of time. Drug treatments for schizophrenia, generally we put them into 2 different classifications, the phenothiazines, and that includes chlorpromazine, and the butorphenones, which includes halperidol, which typically is called Haldol. What do? Well, they block dopamine synapses. They are dopamine antagonists. And hence what they're doing is they're making more dopamine available to the individual. So these neurotransmitter hypotheses, again, the dopamine hypothesis says that schizophrenia is a product of there being excess activity at dopamine synapses, again, in certain parts of the brain. And it's very interesting that there are other disorders like substance abuse, psychotic disorders, for example, which are also characterized by hallucinations and delusions that are very similar to what we see in the case of an individual diagnosed with schizophrenia. The substance abuse psychotic disorder is something that is produced by large and chronic doses of amphetamines, methamphetamines, cocaine. And they too produce this prolonged kind of activity of dopamine at the synapse. So again, that gives, some indirect evidence for this particular hypothesis, the dopamine hypothesis. Schizophrenia, in terms of the limitations of the dopamine hypothesis, one of the things that scientists have learned is that there's increased activity specifically at the what are called dopamine 2 receptors within the brain. But one of the things that has always been very perplexing is that when we actually directly measure dopamine, or we measure dopamine metabolites, generally speaking, they are normal in schizophrenic individuals. And what we also know is that antipsychotic drugs that block dopamine, typically they do it within minutes. But the effects that you see on behavior take a much longer period of time, usually not until 2 or 3 weeks later. So again, this has all been very perplexing in this particular area. The glutamate hypothesis and schizophrenia. Glutamate is another very important neurotransmitter that in the brain, and there's suggestion that in schizophrenic individuals there's deficient activity at glutamate receptors. And this is something that is typically seen in the prefrontal cortical area of the brain. I would not say that this that evidence in this area is as strong as the evidence that we have in terms of dopamine, but nonetheless, it is another theory as to what might be going on in terms of underlying biological determinants. The whole area of second and third generation antipsychotic drugs is a fascinating one. Drug companies, pharmaceutical companies are trying to develop drugs that are going to have fewer side effects and are going to be affecting just single systems instead of multiple systems. And there's a whole class of second and third generation drugs that have been created. One such drug is this one right here, clozapine. And again, if you looked at that very interesting video on Anik, this was the drug that helped her a great deal. But here are some other ones as well. So again, these are more targeted in terms of their effects. They're not anywhere near as many side effects. And they seem to be very effective in terms of getting at these underlying negative symptoms. And now they're becoming much more widely used than they were at one time. There are some interesting animal models for schizophrenia, one of which is called prepulse inhibition. Take a look at this situation that you see here. Here's an animal. This is a rat that's in a tube. And what we're going to do is we're going to sound a large noise. And that noise is going to cause this animal to startle. And we can measure the startle response in this animal very, very precisely. What we can then do is prior to presenting this very loud noise, we can present a light. And again, this is something that's called prepulse inhibition. That it now becomes a predictive cue. The animal now knows that when the light comes on, then the loud noise is going to soon follow. And what happens is the animal inhibits its startle response. It doesn't startle anywhere near as much. What we know is that this is a really good animal model, because we know that schizophrenic human beings have problems in terms of prepulse inhibition. And there's a lot of work that has gone on now that has, in this area, that has really helped us to understand what the biological mechanisms are that are involved in prepulse inhibition. And we can create drugs, for example, that will in which we'll be able to very specifically manipulate this prepulse inhibition in animal subjects. So in normal subjects, the prepulse cue reduces the startle amplitude. And this inhibition of the startle response, once again, is known as PPI, prepulse inhibition. And again, schizophrenics are notorious for not being able to exhibit this prepulse inhibition to this stimulus that comes before the startle response. So it's been used by a lot of pharmaceutical companies to create drugs that might be helpful in treating individuals that are schizophrenic. So a summary of the biological underpinnings. Certainly, a single gene or a single neurotransmitter at this point in time, it can't be identified. It's more likely that it's a combination of a number of different genes, that it's a combination of a number of different neurotransmitters. Some evidence suggests that there's a progressive loss of neural tissue. That's something that we see with those MRI scans that I showed you pictures of earlier. And also know that dopamine and probably glutamate play a role in schizophrenia, but it's in different degrees in different people. And lastly, there's probably multiple genes, multiple abnormalities in terms of the brain. Involvement certainly of dopamine and glutamate, but also probably some involvement of serotonin and GABA as well. So that really represents, where we're at in terms of schizophrenia. It's a fascinating disorder, and one in which we have made some progress, but we certainly have much further to go in terms of understanding its etiology and understanding its biological basis.